Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Rachel Galvin, who is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at University of Chicago. She's also a poet and a translator. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, you've published a couple articles recently on self-translation and Latinx poetry. Why don't we start by defining Latinx poetry? Where does that term come from and what does it mean?
Yeah, so it's a term that might seem to be new, a new trend, but it's actually been around for at least 20 years, the term Latinx. It's a gender-inclusive alternative to the term Latino, Latina, which are the masculine and feminine forms of Latin American or of Latin American descent. At a certain point, people became dissatisfied with Latina, Latino as being too focused on the gender binary and started to look for solutions. So you might remember at a certain point the term Latin with the @ sign as an AO alternative at the end of the word became popular, and academic programs were renamed with that term in it, in the titles. Books were titled with this, and then the evolution of language is such that Latinx was the next step in using the X to indicate not just the masculine and feminine gender, but also non-binary, gender non-conforming and trans peoples. So the term also has a relationship to the Nahua language, which is an indigenous language of the Americas. The X is a very common letter in Nahua, and some people thought that they would use that as a kind of reference to indigeneity as part of the Latinx experience. Maybe 20 years ago, this term started to emerge, and it's picked up steam, and it's become popular now. It's not used uniformly across the board, but it is very prevalent.
It's sort of absorbing a lot of the other terminology, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
And this Nahua group, they're from where? They're
from Mexico.
Oh, Mexican.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. And of course, also this represents a kind of coming together of a lot of different cultures in the Americas, right?
Yes.
Yes. I know we're in the United States, we're familiar with Mexican poets and Cuban and
right.
Puerto Rican poets, but this is really bringing a lot more together.
Yeah, and so that's a really important point. So Latino poetry, Latinx poetry has been traditionally known as comprising Mexican and Puerto Rican authors, and then Cuban. Yeah. But the realities of immigration are such that now in the U.S., there are peoples from all over South America, all over the Caribbean, all over Central America, who are having a huge influence on the culture of the United States, and who need to be included in that pan-ethnic group if that pan-ethnic group is going to be used. Yeah.
And of course, the United States now is included in this pan-ethnic group as well, right?
Yeah, and people of Latin American descent make up the largest minority in the United States and make up 18.5% of the population, which is over 60 million people.
If you think about poetry in the United States, traditionally it was very much linked to England. The Romantic movement had manifestations on both sides of the ocean, of course. In the 20th century, there were a lot of connections there, but this is actually a way of looking at the American canon, if you will, right?
Yes.
In terms of the countries in North and South America, somewhat independent of the European tradition, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's something that's of interest to me, is to think about circuits of dialogue throughout the Americas, not setting Europe aside entirely, but sort of bracketing it and keeping the focus on exchanges and the presence of Latin American poets in the United States, poets of Latin American descent in the United States. That is a different way of orienting, thinking about poetry in the US. I mean, somebody could also argue that poetry has been written in Spanish on the land that is now known as the United States for centuries.
Before anybody was writing in English,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. And concurrent with the emergence of what we think of as US American literature. So some people go back as far as the epic poems written by the Spanish conquistadors of the 16th century, in drawing a kind of genealogy of Latinx poetry through to the present.
Now, you're looking at poets translating their own work.
Yeah.
Which seems to me is a little more meaningful in the Latinx environment that we're talking about here, because these are poets maybe who grew up speaking two languages.
Yes.
And are thinking in both languages.
Yes.
And so instead of somebody else translating word for word what a poet in another language said into English, they're actually doing their own translations into English, maybe Portuguese, Spanish. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I find interesting about it. So instead of having an original text that's translated by a translator who maybe doesn't have access to the culture, the experiences, the associations with the original text, who does or who doesn't, either way. Here we have a case where poets are translating their own work and sometimes even writing a poem in two languages simultaneously. So it becomes hard to say which is the original and which is the translation or the copy. Because the translation, let's say you write first in Spanish and you begin translating in English, and then you go back and you tweak something in the Spanish, and then that changes something in the English. So it becomes hard to disentangle. And so when we think about translation, we often think about the original to the target language, and this becomes much more complicated in this situation.
Yeah. Well, so I know in my own case, if I'm writing, if I'm looking at something again, I think, oh, I should have said this instead of that. This would have been a better word. So if you're translating your own work, you're really still in the process of writing it, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And that's right. It becomes hard to draw a boundary between the writing and the translating.
So as you're looking at this, have you seen some significant differences and some evolving ideas and things?
Yes, absolutely. And that's really interesting to me. So a few poets from Puerto Rico I've written about recently. Urayuan Noel, who is a Puerto Rican born poet, critic, translator who teaches at NYU, lives in New York, and also another named Roque Raquel Sala Rivera, who's a trans Puerto Rican poet who lived in the US for a while and was the Poet Laureate of Philadelphia and is now back in San Juan. And both of them have published really interesting self-translated works where there's a kind of dialogue between the Spanish and the English and a playfulness. Both of them coin words in one language and then coin different words in the other language to correspond to them. So if you were to sit the two versions side by side, you might find really significant differences. So that's something that I find really interesting. Another poet, a Mexican-American poet named Mónica de la Torre, recently published a book where she took one poem she had written in the 90s and published in Mexico City in the 90s from Spanish, and then did 25 translations into English that are all different and all playful. Yeah.
She's really playing with the idea. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to delve into this, was there a good starting point? What would you recommend?
I would recommend all three of those poets.
Okay.
Wholeheartedly. They're fantastic. They're very exciting. Yeah.
If you have experience in both cultures and you're translating, that you're actually speaking for both cultures instead of speaking for one to the other at times?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah, that's sort of a new phenomena here, because I don't know of any examples of that, I think, in maybe in European literary tradition, but maybe there are, I don't know.
One of the reasons I'm interested in self-translation right now is that it's a development in Latinx poetry. I'm seeing a wave of writers trying their hand at that. And part of this is generational, right? We have poets like those I mentioned who are completely proficient in two languages and in two cultures, or perhaps multiple languages actually, and can easily go back and forth. When we look back at the important Chicano and Nuyorican poetry of the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, poetry, either poems are written in Spanish or they tend to be written in English with just a word of Spanish dropped in here or there, or a phrase. And because of many publishing interests at the time, those phrases are marked as foreign because they're italicized, or there's an appendix or a glossary or footnote, right, to kind of help the reader who's
that maybe the poet didn't intend.
Exactly. Yeah. Many times the poets don't make these decisions, right, and they have to go with what the publisher wants to do. So we've seen a kind of transformation over the past 60 years now, where there's been a tendency toward code switching, code mixing, and then finally these kinds of more thoroughgoingly bilingual techniques that lead to self-translation.
And sometimes these poems are a form of activism. They're efforts to bring about changes, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Has that evolved, or how do you see that today?
Yeah, I see that as a real constant from looking to the late 19th century to the present, which is something that might seem surprising too, coming from an English U.S. American poetry background, to see the profound imbrication of political commitment and activism in poetic texts themselves and in the work in the world that poets do. So. Jose Marti, who we were discussing earlier from Cuba, was very critical about the U.S.'s actions in Latin America and in Cuba in particular in the 1890s, and wrote some key texts that have remained very important to writers from across Latin America since then. Salomón de la Selva, who wrote the first book of poetry in English published in the U.S. by a Latin American in 1918, called Tropical Town. You know, he was hobnobbing with Pound and Eliot and all of the kind of, all of the sort of high modernists of the time.
Was he an imagist? Was he
No, and
stylistically
he was a little bit 19th century, compared to the early 20th century and the sort of high modernist moment. Right. But, you know, he was critical of the U.S.'s role in Nicaragua, which is where he was from. And he served as a translator for Rubén Darío, actually, who is the inventor of Modernismo from Nicaragua. So stretching all the way back to those figures, looking at the importance of poetry for the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement in the 60s, the New Yorkers, the Young Lords in New York, who were all fighting for social justice.
Even the anti-war movement in the 60s.
The anti-war movement, and many of these movements were, the Chicano movement was working with Cesar Chavez, right, with the United Farm Workers, to improve conditions for workers. Looking at that kind of moment of fervent when poetry was really important. People were reading poems at rallies.
And folk music was booming.
Folk music, street theater, you know, performance was really important for bringing people together and to unite around a message and to create solidarity. And that hasn't gone away. So, for example, in 2015, a group of poets who called themselves the Undocu Poets, because they were undocumented at the time, worked together to put together an open letter and collect signatures to pressure 8 major literary contests that recognize poetry to stop including a citizenship requirement for the application. And they were successful, which was a huge coup, you know. And so they've remained an active group today and are publishing an anthology soon. So they've done really important work in that sense. So just to say that there's a long history of the relationship between poetry and activism when you look at Latinx literature.
So the borders are going down, at least in a literary sense here, right?
People are working on it.
They're trying. You know, it's just interesting because, you know, so often the United States is in the role of the oppressor. I mean, is that a constant throughout all of this, or is that evolving, do you think?
It's a constant. I mean, you know, it's hard to generalize. Poets have different kinds of politics and different relationships to America's political positions and various governments, but that is certainly a common thread. You know, and for Puerto Rican poets, it's a complicated situation. Again, being U.S. citizens, but not having federal voting rights. And then, of course, what happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017, when FEMA did not show up, when aid was not given.
That's been a subject of a lot of the poetry, I understand, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some of the poets that I mentioned earlier have written some incredible poems. Ureo Anuel has an ode to Maria as the name of the hurricane, and also his grandmother. And Roque Salas Rivera has a book called While They Sleep, Under the Bed is Another Country, which maybe describes the situation of Puerto Rico vis-a-vis the mainland U.S.
The U.S.
Yeah.
What's the role of literary magazines and independent publishers in all of this?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So, magazines first. I've been looking into the way that magazines have helped to create circulation and exchange and to actually foster and cultivate translation from the 1950s through the present. The magazines, the 50s and 60s that were edited by Robert Bly and several other people, for example, began translating a poet who you may have heard of, Pablo Neruda from Chile,
Sure.
who's one of the few Latin Americans that has gotten translated multiply, and really opened up interest to an American readership for South American poetry. Skipping forward, there's a literary magazine from Argentina that's published in Buenos Aires it recently ceased publication, but it was called Diario de Poesía. And this, during the 90s, directly after the end of the Argentine dictatorship, was fostering translation of objectivist poets from the United States or contemporary poets of the 90s, and publishing really creative translations of American poets. So those are sort of two flashpoints that I find of interest. And then the third I would mention is called Mandorla, which ran from 1991 to 2013, and it was actually published concurrently from Mexico City and Illinois. So it was a sort of international effort to locate, sponsor, cultivate, foster poetry of the Americas in a kind of hemispheric way, and again to create dialogue. So they published all kinds of exciting poets, writing in Spanish, writing in English, sometimes translated, sometimes not translated. Different kinds of code switching appears as well. And that was a really innovative magazine, which happily has recently been totally digitized by Northwestern University through their Open Door archive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's all accessible now.
That's great. And what about some of the bigger trends that we're seeing? The emergence of the feminist perspective and the gender issues and things.
Yep.
How do they work into all of this?
Yeah.
Getting back to the poetry itself.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. One feminist poet who's often thought of is Gloria Anzaldúa, who was Mexican-American, Chicana. She said she spoke 8 languages, including all the varieties of Spanish and English that she spoke. And she was a queer feminist activist who published, particularly in the 80s, very much pushing forward the women of color critique, and both in her writing and her poetry, which really bent the kind of boundaries around what do we think of as an essay, what do we think of as a poem, and how to connect them together. So she's a very, very important figure to look back to. But I've been looking at some really contemporary writers and writing about them recently, especially thinking about how to create gender inclusivity when you're writing in Spanish. Considering that, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, Spanish is a heavily gendered language because it's a Romance language. So
More so than English.
way more so than in English, it's much easier, exactly, to be more gender inclusive and to say they,
Right.
right? So Spanish and other Romance languages like French and others and Italian have the problem where every object is gendered. So this table, la mesa, is feminine. Why? Why is the table feminine, right? So every part of the world is gendered, including people and adjectives related to people. So people have developed certain ways to work around that have taken up, that have gotten traction in the past decade or so, maybe a little bit longer than that actually. So the X ending is one of them, which has been criticized as being an imperial importation from English. Another solution that's been brought up and has really gotten traction across Spanish-speaking countries is the final letter E, because it is gender neutral. So that's something that is making its way into the conversation very quickly and has a somewhat longer history. But some of the poets that I'm looking at are taking that sort of now common solution to creating gender-inclusive language and doing wildly creative things with it. So, for example, a Cuban-American poet named Achi Ovejas a queer feminist activist, former journalist who's mostly known for her novels, but she, just a couple years ago, published a self-translated book where she changed the gender of all the nouns and all the objects in the world to make them neutral, this is the only book I've seen that does that. So that's a very innovative way of saying not just people, but also the objects around us need to be gender inclusive in order to change the way we think, to change the way that, language structures the way we see the world. And so that's her intervention.
Well, and poets should be leading the way on those things, right? They're closest to it. And another issue that's of growing concern is migration and displacement. Has that become an important theme?
Yes, for sure. And some very recognized and celebrated young poets today are certainly writing about migration from Central America and across the Mexican border. Javier Zamora, for example, from El Salvador, has written a terrific book of poems and also a really striking memoir about his experience of coming as an unaccompanied child to the United States, and that experience of going all the way from El Salvador up through Mexico into the US. He was also part of the Undocu Poets movement that I mentioned earlier.
Undocu Poets, yes.
Yeah.
And another thing that intrigues me here is the shifts in spirituality and mysticism as you go from culture to culture. But how is that materializing in all of this?
There is a very strong strain of Catholicism in Latin American cultures, which might not be a surprise.
Right.
And so there is a kind of grappling with that happens in poetry. Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, was very interested in bringing in indigenous belief systems into her worldview alongside those elements. I think of a poet who's not especially known here, but her name is Rosa Chavez. She's from Guatemala. She's Quiche Maya, and she writes about the earth and what's happening to the earth from a Quiche Maya perspective. And her indigenous worldview influences the way that she writes of the Americas and has different names for the continent.
So she's getting into an ecological concern there, then,
Yep,
right?
yep.
And what about
Which
that?
connects to spirituality and a different relationship of humans to land.
Yeah. Do you think there is some historic, thematic impetus here to try to connect things and bring things together a little bit, regardless of what country, what language you're writing in, to try to find the common humanity that we all share?
Through poetry,
Yeah,
you mean?
yeah.
This is a long-standing question about whether poetry does anything to change the world, right? What does poetry matter,
Right.
given all the things that are
Right.
happening right now, know? And in one sense, it doesn't. And in the other sense, it's vital. This is, W.H. Auden has been often misquoted in his elegy for Yeats from 1939, where he says, "Poetry makes nothing happen." That line is often lifted out as kind of proof. People like to quote that as proof that poetry doesn't do
worthless,
anything.
yeah.
And that Shelley was wrong and Auden was right. But if you keep reading the poem, the rest of the section, he says that it carries on in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. And at the end of the stanza, he says, it survives. It's a way of happening, a mouth. And I think that actually says so much about what poetry can do as a kind of a mouth, a way to project and amplify, a way to speak to others, a way to make something happen. Poetry is a way that something happens. There's something intersubjective, right? There's a kind of magic that does occur when you read a poem that says something that strikes a chord with you, that puts into language a feeling that you've had that you haven't been able to articulate.
Well, and I think it's what Jürgen Habermas calls the life world, as opposed to the world of technology and the environment around us. And he talks about how that the life world should be what drives us, right? We should decide what we're going to do with the things around us based on who we are and what our values are in that life world. And poetry speaks to that, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and poetry can also tell difficult truths. and it can describe the darkness when we're in a time of darkness, and hopefully give us some light to head toward, right? Poetry can be a first draft of history. When somebody is living in a war zone and they write a poem that's telling something of their experience or what they've witnessed, that's extremely valuable as a document and as something that can be shared. So poetry has many ways of intervening in the world in that sense.
Yeah. Well, so how did you get interested in this? I always ask everyone that at the end of the interview.
Yeah.
What brought you here?
You know, I've been interested in poetry since I could read, basically. I credit my parents for having read to me a lot and having read poetry to me. E.E. Cummings was one of my first loves.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Rachel Galvin for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.